An unknown frontier lawyer, when he threw his hat into the presidential ring in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was considered by many a country bumpkin given to storytelling. But his stories went beyond humor, relieving stress, and carried his philosophy and his beliefs. A whimsical and devoted family man, a shrewd and determined politician, a private and troubled individual burdened by personal loss and national tragedy. Lincoln's life experience honed him into the able and innovative commander-in-chief who guided us through the ultimate national crisis, the American Civil War. Lincoln expressed difficult concepts in simple yet profound language, reaching the common man. His intellect, coupled with his deep humanity, made him the definitive leader of our nation. He preserved the Union. Even the defeated Southerners felt his influence, many of whom soon realized at his untimely death that they had lost perhaps their best friend. Presenting Lincoln here is Phillip Chetwynd, who began portraying Lincoln in 1987 in performances from Virginia to Maine, from the Cub Scouts to the White House, under the name Lincoln for the Ages.
I recall that when I ran for president in 1860, I was solicited by the newspapers for an ancestry in my family. I had to tell them that I don't know much about my ancestry other than the fact that my grandfather was killed by Indians while settling on a piece of land in Kentucky. I know this because my father saw him killed and told me. Myself, I was brought into this world in February of 1809. I led a very simple life as a child, as our family didn't have much money. I went to school in what I call littles, a little here and a little there. And the reason for that was quite often I would be kept out of school so I could tend to chores back at the homestead. Now, there are a couple of incidents which happened to me as a boy for which I was fortunate enough to survive. Once was when I was playing with my friend Austin down by the creek, and I fell in, and I immediately began to drown since I never could swim a lick. Well, poor Austin became greatly distraught, and he managed to get a stick just long enough to reach out and snag my shirt and pull me in. Rolled me around on the ground for a couple of minutes and got the water out of my lungs, saved my life. The other incident was when I had taken some grain down to the mill to grind it, and I got kicked in the head by a horse. I was giving the horse the command, "Get up, old hussy, get up, old hussy." I went, "Get up," and the horse kicked me. They say the first words out of my mouth 3 days later were, "Old hussy," which is the rest of the command I'd been giving the horse. Well, we moved a couple of times when I was a boy. Once was when we moved from Kentucky to Indiana. And when we arrived in Indiana, we were quite happy for a year or two. And then my mother took ill in 1818 with something called the milk sickness. Now, the milk sickness is when the cows get out into the woods and eat a particular type of root called snake root. And it contaminates the milk in the cow. Doesn't hurt the cow, but if people milk the cow and drink the milk, they become poisoned. There may be cases of people who have survived milk sickness, but I don't know of any. We moved again when we moved from Indiana to Illinois. And I remember that move because it was in the winter. Father always seemed to be moving us in the winter. Well, as we were traveling along the river, I saw a lot of large pieces of ice floating freely in the river. And I saw that a rather small dog had become trapped on one of the pieces of ice. So I did something for which my father always said I was a bit of a fool. I took off my boots and socks, rolled up my pant legs, and I waded out into the river and rescued the dog. Of course, the dog was quite grateful and licked my face for several minutes, and then we put him down and lost sight of him. Well, shortly after arriving in Illinois, I reached the age of 21. Now that was important to me because, you see, by law, back then, any money you made at any job you had, when you were under the age of 21, you couldn't keep it. You had to give the money to your parents. So when I reached 21, I went out to live on my own at a place called New Salem. Now, when I got to New Salem, of course, I began to get an interest in a lot of things. I joined a local debating society, went around the countryside making stump speeches, which is just about what it sounds like. You find a tree stump, stand up on it, and start talking. Hopefully somebody will come along that want to hear it. Well, I also got my interest in the law at that time. I began studying the law, got a hold of a book, very basic, and began to study. And eventually I borrowed books from some of the prominent lawyers in the area. I ran a store while I was in New Salem. Of course, the store failed, and it took me some time to pay off all the debts. Well, they even made me postmaster in New Salem. They figured I could handle that since there were only 1 or 2 pieces of mail that came through in a week. Now, I also got my vast military experience in New Salem during the Black Hawk War. I was elected a captain of militia, and to give you an idea what kind of commander I was, I had my troops lined up in a single line moving across the field, and I noticed up ahead a picket fence with a small opening in it. And I couldn't remember what the command was to make them go from one line into columns of 2. And we kept getting closer and closer to the fence. Finally, out of sheer desperation, I hollered, "Halt! Disband and reform on the other side." Well, not much of a military command, but it did achieve the desired effect. There was one thing my friends said to me when I was in New Salem, because I had not been a success at anything, is they said there's always one profession you can get into, and you don't even have to be too smart to do it. Well, I thought that sounded pretty good. I said, "What's that?" They said, "You can get involved in politics." Well, I took them up on that, and I did get involved. I served 4 terms in the Illinois State Legislature. Of course, I didn't do much there but take up space. And I served 1 term in the U.S. Congress. That was under the Polk administration during the Mexican War. I was very unpopular at that time because I did not support the Mexican War. And I also helped introduce legislation which would have abolished slavery in the District of Columbia. So because of these views and them being unpopular, I only served 1 term. And after my term was up, I went back to what was a thriving law practice by then, and never thought I'd get involved in politics again. Of course, one should never say never, because I did get involved in politics again when I ran against my old friend Steve Douglas for his Senate seat in '58. Now, we had a series of debates, 7 in all, in which the main difference between us was that he believed any new territory applying for statehood should be allowed to choose for themselves whether they're slave or free. And I felt any new territory applying for statehood should come in as a free state, stop the extension of slavery, but not interfere with it where it already existed. Now, I lost that election, but because all the newspapers came from all over the country and covered our debates, more people across the country were reading about where I stood on the issues. So, as a result, 2 years later, when the new Republican Party offered me their platform to run for president, I was able to gain the presidency. Now, I think that's a fair exchange. Mr. Douglas got to keep his Senate seat, but I got the presidency. Mr. Douglas and I always seemed to be on opposing sides, whether it was in the courtroom or politically. Why, he was even courting Miss Todd at the same time I was. And I met Miss Todd at a social that was being held by her brother-in-law, Ninian Edwards. And I remember when I was introduced to her, I was quite taken. I told Miss Todd I would like to dance with her in the worst way. Well, she told her friends later that I truly did dance with her in the worst way. Apparently I stepped on her toes a couple of times. Well, we've had 4 sons. My oldest son, Robert, who was serving with General Grant on his staff. My second son, Eddie, and was born in '46, and then my third son, William Wallace Lincoln, was born in 1850, the same year that my second son, Eddie, passed away. And then my fourth son was born. His name was Thomas, but I call him Tad because his head is so large in proportion to the rest of his body, he reminds me of a tadpole swimming in the pond. And he's a bit of a rascal. He likes to come in and bring the goats in with him, and they run up and down the halls of the executive mansion, and Mrs. Lincoln chasing him and the goats, trying to get him to go back outside. He even comes into cabinet meetings, and he has his toy gun, and he's yelling, bang, 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 and he's running through the room. He climbs under the table, all over the cabinet members' feet. And they just look at me and get madder and madder because they expect me to do something. I don't do anything. Let them run. Now, my cabinet members, there's an interesting lot of gentlemen. Mr. Seward, when I ran for president in 1860 and I chose him as my Secretary of State, he was at the time the leading Republican. Well, he thought he was going to be the fox in charge of the hen house. Of course, I had to set him straight on that. And then there's my Secretaries of Treasury and War, Secretaries Chase and Stanton, a couple of solemn fellas, but they have mentioned, I remember one time when Mr. Chase had said to Mr. Stanton that he was curious about the pattern of his beard because the hair on his head was so dark, but his beard was so white. I said, I think that's perfectly clear. It means Mr. Stanton uses his jaw more than his head. Stanton laughed even at his own expense. Chase did not. Well, in this struggle, both sides pray to the same God. Yet one would destroy the nation while I have the solemn duty of preserving it. May God, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, secure a just and lasting peace that we might once again be one nation under God.